The first time the truth hit me, it wasn't like some movie moment where the room spins and you drop a glass in slow motion, because real life doesn't give you that kind of clean choreography. It gives you something worse, which is the exact same living room you've sat in 1,000 times suddenly turning into a crime scene in your head, and it gives you the sound of your own wife laughing, soft, private, affectionate, into her phone while she thinks you're out back taking the trash to the curb. And it gives you the awful clarity of recognizing that laugh as the one she used to save for me. It was a Tuesday, plain and ugly in that way Tuesdays always are in the Midwest, with sleet tapping the windows and our old furnace kicking on like it was annoyed at having to do its job, and I remember I had one of those days where everything was already just slightly off before the real nightmare started, because I'd left my travel mug on the roof of my car and watched it roll off in the driveway, coffee exploding like a little brown grenade all over the concrete, and I tried to laugh about it the way married people do when they're pretending the little stuff doesn't matter, and my wife, Marissa, had barely looked up from her screen when she said, "That's rough," like she was talking to a coworker, not her husband. That should have been my first sign, but when you've been with someone for 8 years, you learn to explain away a lot, and I had gotten very, very good at explaining away Marissa. For context, I'm 36, and I live just outside Des Moines, Iowa, in one of those neighborhoods where the houses all look like they came from the same mold and the mailboxes line up like soldiers, and everyone has at least one decorative sign from Hobby Lobby telling you to gather in a dining room nobody uses. I work as a project manager for a commercial HVAC company, which means I spend my days juggling contractors, timelines, and angry emails from people who want miracles in half the time for half the money, and I come home mentally fried, hoping the person I married is still my safe place instead of just another problem to solve. Marissa is 34 and works in event planning for a local hospitality group, which sounds glamorous when she tells people at parties, but mostly means she's on her phone constantly, smoothing out disasters before anyone sees them, and somewhere along the way she started treating our marriage like one more event she had to manage, which meant keeping me fed, vaguely informed, and out of the way. The initial signs of trouble weren't dramatic, and that's part of what makes me feel so stupid now, because it wasn't like she suddenly started coming home at 3 a.m. smelling like cologne with lipstick on her neck. It was smaller, quieter, and honestly more sinister because it made me question my own sanity. She started guarding her phone like it was a state secret, and not in the "everyone deserves privacy" way, but in the "screen angled away from you, notifications silenced, sudden brightness changes when you walk into the room" way, and she started picking fights over dumb stuff that never used to matter, like the way I loaded the dishwasher or the fact that I'd buy the wrong brand of pasta, and I'd find myself apologizing just to get the peace back even when I knew, deep down, I hadn't actually done anything wrong. She also started dressing up more, but not for me, and I know that sounds petty, but I mean she'd put on real effort, hair curled, makeup sharp, perfume that had some bite to it, on nights when she claimed she was just meeting people from work, and then she'd come home and peel it all off like armor, like she was exhausted from performing, and she'd flop into bed and roll away from me as if my body was a chore she didn't have time for. The biggest shift, the one I can't stop replaying, was how she talked about my brother, Derek, like he was suddenly some kind of heroic figure instead of the slightly irresponsible golden retriever of a human being he'd always been. Derek is 32, the younger brother who somehow always had an excuse for why he was crashing on someone's couch or switching jobs again, the guy who could charm a bartender into free shots and then forget his wallet, and I'm not saying that to be cruel, because I love him, I really do, but he's always been the type who skates through life on good looks and confidence and the assumption that someone else will catch him if he falls. He'd moved back to Iowa last year after a messy breakup in Colorado, and for a while I was genuinely happy he was close again because we'd always been tight growing up, and I'd missed having him around for Sunday football and beer runs and those dumb brother conversations where nothing important gets said but you still feel better afterward. Marissa, though, started getting invested, in a way that made my stomach tighten if I let myself focus on it, because she'd ask about Derek more than she'd ask about my day, and she'd laugh at his texts, and she'd insist we invite him over, and she'd do this thing where she'd touch his arm when she spoke to him, lightly, like a little punctuation mark, and if I noticed, she'd give me this innocent, wide-eyed look like I was the one being weird. I told myself I was being paranoid, because the idea of a wife cheating is one thing people can wrap their heads around in an abstract sense, but the idea of her cheating with your brother is so grotesque and personal that your brain rejects it like a bad organ transplant, and I didn't want to be the guy who accused his wife of something that disgusting just because she was being distant. I also didn't want to be the guy who accused his brother, because I grew up with Derek, I carried him on my shoulders at state fairs, I covered for him when he snuck out as a teenager, I punched a guy in high school because he called Derek a slur, and I thought that history meant something, I thought blood meant a line you didn't cross. So when my gut started whispering, I drowned it out with routine, with work, with pretending the coldness at home was just stress, and with the worst coping mechanism of all, which is hope. The discovery didn't happen because I was clever, or because I hired a private investigator, or because I checked her location like some paranoid villain, it happened because the universe has a sick sense of timing and because my wife got careless for about 30 seconds. That Tuesday night, the one with the furnace and the sleet, Marissa told me she was going to run out for a quick planning meeting with a new venue manager, which already felt weird because it was after 8, and her industry is chaotic, sure, but not usually chaotic at 8 on a weekday. And I remember watching her put on boots and that green coat she looks good in and grabbing her keys with the kind of brisk confidence that made it seem like I was the inconvenient furniture she had to step around. I asked, casually, like I didn't care, "Do you want me to make dinner or are you eating out?" And she didn't even pause as she said, "I already ate," which was another small knife because we used to eat together even if it was just boxed mac and cheese on the couch, and now she was living a parallel life where meals happened without me. About 20 minutes after she left, my phone buzzed with a text from Derek, and I remember it clearly because it was one of those dumb brother things that would have made me smile any other day, something like, "You watching the game or being responsible?" And I started typing back, and then my phone rang, and the caller ID flashed Marissa's name, and I had that stupid instinctive little flicker of relief like, maybe she forgot something and she's calling to joke about it, maybe we're fine, so I answered with this forced upbeat tone, "Hey, what's up?" And all I heard was muffled sound, a low rush like fabric against a microphone, and then her voice, not talking to me, but talking close to the phone, breathy and irritated, saying, "Stop, not yet, he'll notice," and then a man's voice, laughing softly, saying, "He won't, he's at home," and then the call cut out like she'd realized what she'd done and smashed the red button. I stood there with my phone pressed to my ear like an idiot, listening to nothing, staring at the kitchen counter where the coffee stain from earlier had dried into this ugly blotch, and I remember thinking, there are a lot of reasons a call can disconnect, and then immediately thinking, there are not a lot of reasons she would say that sentence. My hand started shaking, and I tried calling back, and it went straight to voicemail, and I tried again, and I could feel my heart doing that painful thud against my ribs like it wanted out, and for a moment I just paced, because pacing is what you do when your brain is trying to outrun reality. I told myself it could be a misunderstanding, it could be a coworker, it could be some drunk guy at a bar, it could be anything, and then my phone buzzed again, and when I looked down, it was a message from Marissa that said, "Sorry, pocket dial, in a meeting, talk later," and it was so neat and controlled that it didn't calm me, it terrified me, because it meant she knew she'd slipped, and she'd immediately patched the hole like a professional. I wish I could say I handled that moment with dignity, but I didn't, because dignity is for people whose worlds aren't collapsing, and I went straight for the one thing I had always told myself I'd never do, which was snoop. Her iPad was on the couch, plugged in, because she always forgot to charge things, and it was unlocked because she trusted the house more than she trusted me, and I sat down with my stomach twisting and my throat tight, and I opened her messages, telling myself I was just going to look long enough to reassure myself. The thing is, reassurance is not what you get when you start digging, because once you open that door, you're not looking for comfort anymore, you're looking for the truth, even if it rips you apart. At first it was just normal stuff, group chats about work, her mom sending her Facebook links, one of her friends complaining about her boyfriend, and then I saw a thread labeled D, and my brain tried to play dumb, because D could mean anything, but my thumb was moving before my brain caught up, and I opened it, and there it was, like stepping on a landmine you didn't see because you assumed the field was safe. The messages weren't vague, they weren't flirty in a way you could rationalize, they were intimate, casual, familiar, the kind of shorthand two people use when they've been doing something wrong long enough that it feels normal. There were lines like, "I miss you," and "he's asleep," and "next time at your place," and then the one that made me actually gag, because I'm not exaggerating, my stomach lurched like it wanted to empty itself, which was Marissa saying, "I swear you're better than him," and Derek replying, "You picked the wrong brother," followed by a string of laughing emojis that felt like nails. I kept scrolling because some part of me still wanted a loophole, wanted to find a sentence that explained this away, and what I found instead were timestamps that went back months, and little references to family gatherings, like Marissa saying, "Your mom was watching me the whole time," and Derek saying, "She doesn't see what she doesn't want to see," and Marissa replying, "I hate lying to him," and Derek saying, "Then stop lying and come be with me," and her responding with, "Not yet, I need to figure it out." It was the most brutal kind of betrayal because it wasn't an accident, it wasn't a one-time mistake, it was a whole relationship running alongside mine, using my home like a prop, using my trust like a resource, and I sat there in the dim living room with the furnace humming and the sleet tapping the windows, and I realized I was the only person in my own marriage who thought we were still married. The confrontation happened the same night because I'm not built for quiet suffering, and also because I knew if I waited, I would talk myself out of it, I would let her charm me, or cry, or twist it into something I was responsible for, and I couldn't let that happen once I'd seen the words. I didn't know where she was, but I had a pretty sick guess, and I drove to Derek's apartment with my hands clenched so hard on the steering wheel that my knuckles went white, and the whole way I was talking to myself like a lunatic, rehearsing what I'd say, imagining 100 different outcomes, some of them involving me doing something stupid, and I kept telling myself, "Do not do anything that ruins your life." Because even in that fog of rage, I had this clear, cold awareness that one wrong move and I'd be the villain in my own story. Derek's place is in a newer complex on the west side, the kind of place with fake stone exteriors and a tiny gym nobody uses, and when I pulled in, I saw Marissa's car immediately, parked 2 spots from Derek's, and it felt like my lungs forgot how to work. I sat there for a second, staring at her license plate like it was an accusation, and then I got out, and I remember the air was sharp and cold and it made my eyes water, which was almost funny because it meant I looked like I was already crying before I even got to the door. I buzzed his unit, and there was a pause, and then Derek's voice came through the intercom, casual as anything, saying, "Yeah," and I said, "Let me in," and there was another pause, longer this time, like he recognized my voice and his brain was scrambling for a lie, and then the door clicked and I walked into the lobby and up the stairs with my heart pounding so hard it felt like it was bruising me from the inside. When Derek opened the door, he tried to play it cool, and I swear that's the part that almost pushed me over the edge, because he stood there in sweatpants like this was just a normal brother visit, and behind him I could see the soft glow of his living room lamp, and I could smell that overly sweet candle he always burns, and then Marissa appeared in the hallway behind him, wrapped in one of Derek's hoodies like it belonged to her, her hair a little messy, her cheeks flushed, and for a second, all 3 of us just froze in this grotesque tableau where the truth didn't even need words anymore. Marissa was the first one to speak, and her voice came out high and sharp, like she was trying to seize control of the narrative by force, and she said, "What are you doing here?" as if I was the one who'd shown up somewhere I didn't belong, and I laughed, but it wasn't humor, it was this broken sound that came out of me like I was choking on it, and I held up my phone with her iPad messages open, because I'd screenshotted them like my life depended on it, and I said, "I'm here because my wife is wearing my brother's hoodie, and because I know exactly what you've been doing, and because I'm not going to let you look me in the face and pretend I'm crazy anymore." Derek's face went pale in this slow, dawning way, like he'd always assumed he'd talk his way out of consequences, and for once he couldn't find the script, and he stammered, "Man, listen, it's not," and I cut him off so hard my voice startled even me, because it came out raw, vibrating with rage, and I said, "Do not say, it's not what it looks like, to me. Because it looks like you've been climbing into my bed from the side and smiling at me across Thanksgiving dinner, and I have never wanted to hit someone more in my entire life than I want to hit you right now." Marissa stepped forward, and her eyes were already glossy like she was gearing up for tears, and she did that thing she always does when she wants to flip the conversation into emotion, so I'll soften, and she said, "Please, can we talk about this calmly?" and I could barely breathe because the audacity of it was like being slapped, and I said, calmly, dragging the word out like it tasted bad, you have been lying to my face for months. You have been sleeping with my brother, and you want calm. Like this is a budget meeting or an argument about laundry. She flinched at the word, sleeping, like naming it out loud made it more real, and she shot Derek a look that was part panic and part anger, and then she turned back to me and said, I didn't plan for it to happen like this, and I remember thinking, so you did plan for it to happen, and that thought was like a nail driven in deeper. Derek tried again, voice shaky, going for the brother angle like that would save him, and he said, I never wanted to hurt you, and I stared at him so hard my vision blurred, and I said, you never wanted to hurt me, but you wanted my wife, and you wanted what I built, and you wanted to feel like you could take something from me and still have me call you bro, and I don't know what kind of person does that, but I know it isn't the brother I thought I had. Marissa started crying then, real tears, and she reached out like she was going to touch my arm, and I stepped back so fast I hit the wall in the hallway, because the idea of her hands on me made my skin crawl, and I said, don't touch me, don't even pretend you're the victim here, and she sobbed, I'm not saying I'm the victim, and then, because she couldn't help herself, she added, but you haven't been there. And that's when something in me went cold, because it was the oldest excuse in the book, the one cheaters used to make their betrayal feel like a response instead of a choice. I leaned forward, close enough that I could see the mascara starting to smudge under her eyes, and I spoke slowly because I wanted every word to land like a weight, and I said, you do not get to rewrite our marriage to justify this, because I have been here, I have been paying bills, fixing things, showing up to your family events, loving you in the ways you claim to want, and if you were unhappy, you could have told me, you could have left, you could have done 100 things that weren't crawling into my brother's arms and laughing about how you picked the wrong brother. Derek made a sound like he was going to argue, like he wanted to say it was just jokes, and I snapped my eyes to him and said, and you don't even get the dignity of an excuse, because you knew exactly what you were doing, and you did it anyway, and I swear to God, I will never forgive you. Marissa's voice went sharp through the tears, desperate and angry all at once, and she said, so what, you're just going to throw everything away, and I felt this weird, painful urge to laugh again because she was saying I was throwing it away, as if the marriage was a plate she dropped and I was refusing to pick up the pieces, and I said, you already threw it away, I'm just refusing to pretend it didn't shatter. Derek stepped into the doorway like he was trying to block me from leaving, like he thought this could still be controlled if he physically contained it, and he said, don't tell Mom, don't tell anyone, let's just figure it out, and the rage in me flared so hot it almost made me dizzy, because the idea that they wanted secrecy, after months of secrecy, after building this whole hidden life, made me feel like I was choking, and I said, no, you don't get to figure it out in private, you don't get to keep your reputation intact while I'm the one bleeding out quietly. Marissa's tears slowed and her face shifted into something harder, and I saw, in that moment, the woman I'd been married to not as my partner but as someone capable of protecting herself at any cost, and she said, if you blow this up, you'll ruin the family, and that sentence, coming from her mouth while she stood in my brother's hallway in my brother's hoodie, was so obscene that it almost made me calm, because it showed me exactly what I needed to know, which was that she was still trying to make me responsible for her choices. I nodded slowly, like I was agreeing, and then I said, I'm not the one who ruined it, Marissa, I'm just the one who finally turned the lights on, and I stepped around Derek, and he grabbed my wrist, and I yanked it back so hard it hurt, and I said, low and ugly, if you ever put your hands on me again, I'll make sure the next person you explain yourself to is a judge, and that must have landed because he let go like he'd been burned. I walked out into the freezing air and sat in my car shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition, and I stayed there for a long time, staring at the building like it might change shape if I looked hard enough, like it might turn back into a place where my brother was just my brother and my wife was just my wife. The reality didn't change, though, and what did change was me, because something in my chest cracked open and spilled out all over the steering wheel, and I realized I wasn't just angry, I was grieving, and I was terrified, and I was sickened in a way that felt physical, like the betrayal had left a bruise inside my organs. I drove home with the radio off because I couldn't stand the idea of cheerful voices in that moment, and when I got back to the house, it felt wrong, like I was trespassing in my own life, and I sat on the edge of the bed that still smelled faintly like Marissa's shampoo, and I stared at the wall until my eyes burned. That's when I did the one thing that, at the time, felt like my last shred of control, because I couldn't unsee what I'd seen and I couldn't unknow what I knew, and I also couldn't let them spin this into some neat lie where I was the unstable husband and they were just confused, or in love. Derek had a girlfriend, Lena, who'd been in his life for almost a year, and she was the kind of woman who always brought a bottle of wine and asked thoughtful questions and actually looked you in the eye when you spoke, and I'd liked her immediately because she didn't treat Derek like a lost puppy, she treated him like an adult who should act like one. I found her number in an old group chat, and my thumb hovered over it for a long time because I knew the moment I hit call, there was no going back, there was no version of this where things quietly healed in the dark, and I also knew, deep down, that she deserved to know the truth even if it detonated her world the way mine had just detonated. When I finally pressed the call button, my hand was steady in a way that didn't match how I felt, and the phone rang, and then Lena answered with a sleepy, cautious, hello, and I swallowed hard enough that it hurt, and I said, Lena, it's Evan, and there was a pause where I could hear her sit up, suddenly alert, and she said, is everything okay? And I almost laughed again because what a gentle question that was, what a normal question, and how badly I wanted to live in a world where the answer could be yes. Instead, I took a breath that felt like it scraped my lungs, and I said, no, and I'm about to tell you something that's going to hurt, and I'm calling because you deserve the truth, and because I don't know how to carry this alone, and on the other end of the line, Lena went very quiet, the kind of quiet that means a person's instincts are already bracing for impact. I stared at the dark window above my dresser, seeing my own reflection like a ghost, and I said, Marissa is with Derek right now, and it's not new, and I have the messages, and I confronted them at his place, and I'm telling you because I think you're the only person who will understand how disgusting this feels, and there was a sound from Lena that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a gasp, like her body couldn't decide which reaction to prioritize, and she whispered, no, and then, in a voice that sharpened with sudden clarity, she said, send me everything, and something about those words, about the fact that she didn't ask me to calm down or give Derek the benefit of the doubt, about the fact that she immediately chose reality, made me feel, for the first time that night, like I wasn't completely alone. And that's where I'm going to stop this part, because what happened next is where the shock turned into something heavier, where anger turned into planning, where grief turned into a decision, and where Lena and I, two people blindsided by the same pair of liars, started talking not just about what we'd lost, but about what we were going to do with the truth now that we had it. After I hung up with Lena, the house didn't feel quiet in a peaceful way anymore, it felt quiet like a hospital hallway at night where everyone is pretending nothing is happening while the worst things are happening behind closed doors, and I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the same spot on the wall until my eyes went unfocused and my brain started doing that looping thing where it tries to bargain with reality, because even with the screenshots burned into my camera roll and the image of Marissa in Derek's hoodie burned into my skull, some part of me kept whispering that there had to be another explanation, that I had to have misunderstood, that maybe I was about to ruin my life over some freak misunderstanding, and that whisper was so pathetic I wanted to scream at myself to shut up. Instead, I pulled my phone back out and started organizing the evidence like a man preparing for trial, because once the denial cracked, the fear came rushing in behind it, and it wasn't just fear of losing Marissa, it was fear of being made a fool of, fear of being gaslit into thinking I was abusive or paranoid, fear of waking up 6 months from now with half my savings gone and my family acting like I was the problem because I couldn't forgive, and as humiliating as it is to admit that fear made me meticulous in a way I've never been about anything personal. I emailed myself the screenshots from a brand new account, I saved them to a cloud drive Marissa didn't know existed, and I typed out a timeline like I was trying to convince a stranger instead of myself, because I needed structure, I needed something that wasn't just raw emotion sloshing around inside me with nowhere to go. I didn't sleep, not really, because every time I closed my eyes I saw Derek's face in the doorway, and I heard that laugh from the messages, and I felt this deep, nauseating shame like I had been walking around with a sign on my back that everyone could read but me. Around 3 in the morning I ended up on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, drinking water from the faucet like I was trying to rinse something poisonous out of my mouth, and I kept thinking about all the times Derek had been in my house, all the times Marissa had kissed my cheek and then texted him when she thought I wasn't looking, all the times I'd asked how she was doing and she'd said, fine, with that distant little smile, and it was like my entire recent history had been quietly rewritten without my consent. The next day at work, I made it through about 2 hours before I realized I wasn't actually functioning, because I kept rereading the same email thread without absorbing a single word, and my hands were trembling every time my phone buzzed, and when my boss asked if I could jump on a call with a client, I heard myself say, yeah, sure, in this hollow voice that didn't even sound like me. I finally ducked into my truck at lunch and called Lena, and she answered immediately like she'd been holding her breath since our call, and the first thing she said was, I'm sorry, in this careful, grounded voice that somehow made me feel both seen and wrecked at the same time, because I hadn't realized how badly I needed someone to acknowledge that this was real and awful. I told her I'd sent the screenshots, and she said she'd seen them, and there was a pause where neither of us spoke because what do you say when two people you trusted turned out to be the same kind of cruel, and then Lena said, very quietly, he looked me in the face last night and told me he was going to bed early, and I felt something hot and sharp go through me. Not just anger on her behalf but this sudden clarity that Derek wasn't a confused guy who made a mistake, he was a liar operating on autopilot. Lena and I met that evening at a neutral place because neither of us wanted to sit in our own homes with this, so we picked a little diner off Fleur Drive that smells like grilled onions and burnt coffee, the kind of place where the booths are cracked vinyl and the waitresses call you "hon" without knowing your name, and there was something grounding about being in a normal public space while our private lives were actively imploding. When I walked in, Lena was already there, sitting rigidly with her hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, and the moment she saw me her face did this tight, pained shift like she was trying not to cry in front of a stranger who suddenly wasn't a stranger anymore. She stood up, and for half a second it looked like she might hug me, but we both hesitated because this wasn't a movie and our grief didn't make us automatically intimate, and instead we just sat down and stared at each other like two people arriving at the same wreck from different directions. The emotional impact hit me in layers over those first few days, and the worst part was how unpredictable it was, because one moment I'd be calm and logical and talking to Lena about next steps like I was planning a work project, and the next moment I'd get blindsided by something stupid, like seeing Marissa's favorite cereal in the grocery store or hearing a song we used to play on road trips, and suddenly my throat would close and my eyes would sting and I'd have to leave my cart in an aisle and walk out like I was about to throw up. Anger was the easiest emotion to carry at first because it gave me energy, it made me feel less helpless, it made me want to do something, but underneath it was this heavy sadness that felt like a physical weight on my chest, and underneath that was humiliation so deep it made me want to disappear. I told Lena at one point, in a voice that surprised me with how small it sounded, I keep thinking about the holidays, and she nodded like she understood instantly, and she said, me too, and that shared dread, that sense of every family gathering being contaminated retroactively, made my stomach twist. We talked for hours, and the revenge plan, if you want to call it that, didn't come from some cartoonish desire to destroy them with fake evidence or public humiliation, because both of us were too tired and too real for that. It came from a cold understanding that cheaters thrive in secrecy and confusion, and that if we didn't control the narrative, Derek and Marissa would. Lena had already gotten a couple texts from Derek that morning like nothing was wrong, little, miss you, and, how's your day, messages that made her physically shake when she showed me, because it meant he was capable of lying with the same casual ease someone uses to order lunch. My phone had messages from Marissa too, first apologetic, then defensive, then angry, like she was cycling through emotional strategies to see which one would pull me back into orbit, and the most chilling part was how quickly she shifted into threats once she realized I wasn't responding. One text said, "You're overreacting," another said, "If you do something stupid, you'll regret it," and the fact that she still felt entitled to intimidate me after what she'd done made something in me harden. So Lena and I made a plan that was less about revenge and more about consequences, because consequences are the only language some people understand, and we decided on 3 things. We would lock down our financial and legal situations immediately, we would confront them in a way that left no room for them to spin lies, and we would tell the people who mattered, our families, in a controlled, factual way before Derek and Marissa could soften it into some complicated love story. Lena had a friend from college who was an attorney in family law, and she offered to connect me, and I scheduled a consultation for the next morning because once you've been betrayed like that, you realize love doesn't protect you from paperwork, and the idea of being naive on top of being betrayed made my skin crawl. Lena also started quietly gathering her own evidence, photos of Derek's lies, timestamps, anything that showed the pattern, because she didn't want to be the girlfriend who got talked into believing it was a misunderstanding, and then looked foolish later. The confrontation with Marissa, round 2, happened at our house because I refused to meet her somewhere she could perform for strangers and then used that as proof I was unstable, and when she came home the next night, she walked in like she'd rehearsed it, eyes puffy, shoulders tense, putting on that wounded look that used to melt me. I didn't offer her a hug, I didn't even offer her a seat, because the sight of her made my stomach turn, and she stood in the entryway clutching her purse strap like a shield and said, "Evan, please," and I said, "No," immediately, because I needed her to understand that whatever leverage she used to have over me had evaporated. She tried to cry and explain, she said things like, "It just happened, and we got close, and I was lonely," and I felt this surreal calm as I told her, "It didn't just happen, it happened for months, and you mocked me in those messages," and she flinched like I'd hit her, and she whispered, "You went through my stuff," as if privacy was the true crime in this situation, and I said, "I saw the truth, that's what matters." And for the first time I watched her realize her usual tactics weren't working. When she shifted into anger, it was almost a relief because it showed me who she was underneath the tears, and she hissed, "So what, you're going to destroy Derek too?" And I stared at her and said, "You destroyed him the moment you decided sleeping with my brother was a reasonable choice," and she started pacing like a caged animal, saying, "You're acting like I'm some monster," and my voice rose despite my efforts to stay calm as I said, "You are, to me, because you did the one thing you knew would break me," and she finally blurted, "I love him," and the words hung in the air like smoke, and I felt this weird sensation like my body had gone numb, like my heart was protecting itself by shutting down. I nodded slowly and said, "Then you need to leave," and she said, "Evan," and I cut her off with, "Tonight," and I walked to the closet and pulled out a suitcase and set it by the door because I needed the physical act of it, the finality, the proof that I was not going to be talked out of my own boundary. She tried bargaining then, that desperate middle stage where people offer you anything as long as they don't have to face the real consequences, and she said, "We can go to counseling, we can fix this," and I looked at her and said, "You didn't make a mistake at a bar, Marissa, you built a second relationship with my brother," and she said, "I didn't mean to hurt you," and I answered, "But you did," repeatedly, "and you knew exactly what you were doing every time you lied to my face." She asked, finally, in a voice that sounded scared in a way I hadn't heard before, "Are you really going to divorce me?" And I felt my throat tighten because saying it out loud made it real, but I forced the words out anyway, "Yes," and she made this broken sound and sank onto the bench by the door, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her, and then I remembered Derek's message, * you picked the wrong brother *, and the pity drained out of me like water. Lena confronted Derek separately, and she later told me she did it with a steadiness that shocked even her, because when you finally see someone clearly, your body stops craving their approval. She went to his apartment while he was at work and left his key on the counter with a note that said, "Don't contact me again," and then she blocked him everywhere, and when he showed up at her place pounding on the door like a desperate teenager, she called me with her voice shaking and said, "He's outside," and I told her to call the police if he didn't leave, and she did, and Derek vanished before anyone arrived, which told us everything we needed to know about how brave he was when consequences looked official. The family part was the hardest, and it's the part people who fantasize about revenge never mention, because telling the truth doesn't just hurt the cheaters, it cracks the whole family structure, and I knew the moment my parents heard it, they'd never look at Derek the same way again, and that grief would spill into everything. Still, I wasn't willing to carry the burden alone, and I wasn't willing to let Derek and Marissa rewrite it into something softer, so we told them. Lena came with me when I went to my parents' house on a Saturday afternoon because we thought it would be better if we were both there, united, factual, and because I knew I might fall apart once I started talking. My mom opened the door with a smile that faded the moment she saw my face, and she said, "What's wrong?" and I remember my voice cracking as I said, "We need to talk," and my dad's expression went sharp and worried like he was bracing for a medical emergency. We sat at their kitchen table, the same one where I'd done homework as a kid, the same one where my mom had once cried over bills when we were little, and I told them, slowly, what happened, and the words felt unreal coming out of my mouth, like I was describing a story I'd heard instead of my own life. My mom's hand flew to her mouth, my dad went completely still, and when I said, "It was Derek," my mom made this sound like she'd been punched, and she whispered, "No," over and over, and my dad's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen on him, and he said, in this low voice that made the room feel dangerous, "Is this true?" And I said, "Yes," and I showed them the screenshots because I knew without proof, their brains would try to protect Derek by searching for loopholes. My mom started crying hard, the kind of crying that comes from betrayal and grief mixed together, and my dad stood up so abruptly his chair scraped the floor, and he walked out onto the back porch like he needed air before he did something he'd regret. Derek, predictably, tried to call me after that, and I didn't answer, and then he texted, "We need to talk," and I stared at it for a long time feeling something like mourning, because as angry as I was, part of me was still grieving the brother I thought I had. He showed up at my house later that week, and when I opened the door and saw him standing there with that familiar face and unfamiliar guilt, I felt my hands curl into fists without even thinking. He started with, "Man, I'm sorry," and his voice sounded shaky, and I said, "Don't, because apologies mean nothing when you're apologizing for who you chose to be." He tried to explain, he said, "It got out of control," and I stepped onto the porch and said, "You didn't trip and fall into my marriage," and he flinched, and for a second I saw real fear in him, not fear of hurting me, but fear of losing access to the version of himself where he could do anything and still be loved. He said, "She said you didn't care," and I snapped, "And you believed her because it made it easier to take what you wanted," and he started crying, actual tears, and it should have moved me, it should have softened something, but all I could think about was him laughing in that message thread, and I said, "Get off my property," and he whispered, "You're really cutting me off," and I said, "You cut yourself off," and I closed the door while he stood there like a stranger. The decision and resolution part of all of this, the actual practical moving forward, was both easier and harder than I expected, because once you accept that the marriage is dead, the steps are weirdly straightforward, like you're handling a death with paperwork and logistics instead of grief rituals. I retained a lawyer, I opened a separate bank account, I documented our shared assets, and I stopped speaking to Marissa except through text about necessary logistics because every time I heard her voice, it dragged me back into the emotional mud. She moved in with Derek for a while, which I found out through my mom, and that detail hurt in a specific way I didn't anticipate, because it meant she didn't even pretend to mourn what she destroyed, she just stepped into the next life like I was an old outfit she didn't want anymore. But then the consequences started stacking, not because I schemed to destroy her, but because reality catches up to people who build their lives on lies. Marissa's family, when they found out, didn't rally around her the way she expected, because apparently her sister had always found Derek slimy, and her mom was furious that Marissa had risked her marriage and their relationship with my family for something so selfish and messy. At work, rumors started because Marissa had been careless about where she went and who saw her, and in event planning, reputation matters more than people admit, and suddenly she wasn't a polished professional anymore, she was the woman who blew up her marriage with her husband's brother, and I'm not saying she lost her job because I can't claim I watched it happen from her HR office, but I do know she started posting these vague, angry things online about toxic people and men who can't handle the truth, and the fact that she was still framing herself as the wronged party told me she hadn't learned a thing. Derek, meanwhile, got cut off financially by my parents when my dad finally snapped out of denial, and losing their support hit him hard because Derek had always assumed family was an endless safety net, and suddenly the net was gone. The real resolution for me didn't come from watching them struggle, though, it came in the quiet places where I started rebuilding my sense of self, because betrayal like this doesn't just break your trust in other people, it breaks your trust in your own judgment, and I hated that more than anything. I started therapy because I didn't want this to calcify into bitterness, and because I could feel myself getting obsessed with the why, and my therapist said something that stuck with me even though I wanted to argue, which was that the why is often just because they could, and you can chase deeper explanations forever and still not get closure. I started going to the gym again, not in some dramatic glow-up way but in the boring, daily discipline way that gives your brain something to focus on besides pain, and I started cooking for myself in ways I hadn't in years, little rituals like chopping onions and listening to podcasts that reminded me I could build a life without Marissa in it. Lena and I stayed in contact through all of this, and it would be easy to turn that into some tidy romantic ending, but life doesn't jump that cleanly, and honestly we were both too bruised for anything like that right away. What we did have was this bond that formed in the wreckage, a weird, steady friendship built on brutal honesty, and sometimes we'd meet for coffee and talk about legal steps and family fallout, and sometimes we'd just sit in silence like two people sharing a bench in a storm. Months later, when my divorce was finalized and the house felt more like mine again, Lena came over to help me repaint the guest room because I wanted to change something tangible, and at one point she stood in the doorway with paint on her cheek and laughed, and it was the first time I realized I could hear laughter without flinching. We didn't rush anything, we didn't pretend pain made us soulmates, but we did slowly become something warmer than friends over time, the way people do when they've seen each other at their worst and still stayed, and I'll just say this. A relationship built on truth feels like breathing after months underwater. By the time a year had passed, my life looked nothing like I thought it would, and somehow it was better in ways I couldn't have imagined during those first sleepless nights. I moved to a smaller place closer to downtown, I took a promotion that would have scared me before because it meant more responsibility, and I stopped feeling like I needed Marissa's approval to validate my choices. My parents were still grieving the loss of what they thought our family was, and that part doesn't get a neat bow, because betrayal ripples outward, but there was also a strange honesty that settled in, like we were all finally seeing each other without illusions. Derek faded out of my life entirely, and I learned that blood doesn't automatically mean access, and Marissa, last I heard, was cycling between blaming everyone else and trying to claw back a normal life that no longer fit her, because when you burn down your own foundation, it's hard to rebuild without admitting you lit the match. The conclusion, the thing I've learned and the advice I'd give if someone is reading this with that sick feeling in their gut, is that you have to trust the part of you that notices the quiet changes, the part that keeps track of what doesn't add up, because you're not crazy for seeing patterns, and you're not weak for hoping you're wrong, you're human. I also learned that the urge for revenge is often just the urge for balance, the urge to make reality match the harm that was done, and the healthiest version of that isn't cruelty, it's clarity, boundaries, and consequences delivered through truth and legal protection instead of chaos. If you're in it, if you're staring at a phone screen or replaying a conversation and wondering if you should confront them, my advice is to document what you can, protect yourself financially, get professional support, and do not let someone who betrayed you also control the story of what happened, because the second you let them rewrite it, you start doubting your own sanity, and that's how they keep winning. I used to think happily ever after meant staying married and growing old with the person you chose, and now I think it means waking up without dread, looking in the mirror without shame, and building a life where you don't have to beg for honesty. Marissa and Derek took a part of my past and poisoned it, but they didn't get my future, and the day I finally understood that, really understood it, was the day the betrayal stopped being the center of my life and started being just the chapter that forced me to choose myself.